So I'm delighted to be sharing some of the research I've been doing over the last few years on print rooms in Britain and Ireland. So I'm really going to give quite a general talk today, drawing on some of the research I've been doing. It's very much work in progress, so any thoughts that you have, any leads that you have, all will be very gratefully received. So to begin, in 1774, the highly successful and prolific London print seller Robert Sayer issued his new and enlarged catalogue of prints, advertising a plethora of stock. By this date, the print market was booming, both in production and consumption, and Sayer's catalogue runs to 150 pages, broken down under various headings. On page 34, he shifts from listing individual prints for sale to providing details of his fine prints in sets, and the puff he gives this material is significant. Proper for the collections in the cabinets of the curious, also elegant and genteel ornaments when framed and glazed, and may be fitted up in a cheaper manner to ornament rooms, staircases, etc., with curious borders representing frames, a fashion much in use and produces a very agreeable effect. And then later in the section of the catalogue dealing with books of ornaments, we find decorations for print rooms, viz. Bordering in an infinite variety, festoons of flowers, trophies of various kinds, circles, ovals of different dimensions for heads, landscapes, etc. Every ornament necessary for fitting up print rooms. So this is the subject of my talk today, the fashion much in use by the mid-1770s for fitting up rooms with prints pasted onto the walls, surrounded by curious borders representing frames and decorations of infinite variety. So this kind of schemes that are still extant at Park and Stonyton Park in Somerset that I'm showing you here. Now, there is evidence for earlier print rooms on the continent, but the very particular trend that flourished in Britain and Ireland had started in the 1750s. It reached a fashionable peak in the 1770s and 1780s, and then it gradually fell out of fashion. And the last really notable examples date from the 1820s and 1830s. There's now only a total of 12 and a bit print rooms surviving today in various states of repair and disrepair. So this is my sort of rather homespun map to show you where they are. You'll see from looking around, this number are National Trust properties. So there are print rooms at Park and Petworth in West Sussex, the Vine in Hampshire, Blickling in Norfolk and Cork Abbey in Derbyshire. Other ones open to the public are Castletown near Dublin and Queen Charlotte's Cottage in Kew. And then a number are now in privately owned and inhabited properties. So Henningham Hall in Suffolk, Stratfield Say in Hampshire and Woodhall Park in County Durham. You'll also see here Stonyton Park in Somerset, which was a hotel until recently, but is now on the market. And then Woodhall Park in Hertfordshire, which is still privately owned, but has been leased to a school since the 1930s. So that's the 12. The and bit is at Clongowes Wood College, which is now another school. And the library at Clongowes retains on 2 sections of wall prints from Sir William Hamilton's collection of Etruscan, Greek and Roman antiquities. So there's just 2 sections of wall remaining at that property. So I'm obviously in my project, I'm concentrating on these surviving schemes, but very many more print rooms have been lost. And the more I work on the project, the more cases of destroyed and dismantled schemes I come across. And the poor survival rate isn't really surprising. It was a relatively short-lived fashion. And also, of course, these are very fragile spaces. And I come across traces of lost print rooms in all sorts of ways. So quite often it will be a comment in someone's diary or a journal or a letter about a print room. Sometimes the evidence will come from an inventory or a plan. There was a rather nice smoking gun for the print room at Sion House in Middlesex, where the main source for a lost 18th century print room comes from a payment from the Duke of Northumberland to one Thomas Ponsonby for actually taking down a print room in 1824. So I'm showing you here from the bill book the charge for taking off the walls 100 prints and their printing borders and other ornaments round them, cleaning and drying them flat. But I think in terms of evidence for lost print rooms, what I'm showing you on the right of the screen here is perhaps the most characteristic. So I'm showing you here a print from a set of countesses at Saltram in Devon. So this is from a series of 12 prints after Van Dyck portraits made by Pierre Lombard in the 1660s. And all of these prints at Saltram have plaster and paint stuck on the back, which shows that they were at some point up on a wall in the house. And the list of lost room goes on. So Chatsworth had one, Kedleston had one, Wanstead had one, Raby Castle in County Durham had one. And it seems that if you were rebuilding or refurbishing in the second half of the 18th century, then there's a reasonable likelihood that you would create a print room. They were so popular that there's even a doll's house from the period in which the dining room has been fitted out as a print room. And as wallpaper manufacturers would mimic the effects of stucco or damask in their designs, so too would they mimic the look of print rooms, as in the case of this surviving paper I'm showing you from Doddington Hall in Lincolnshire, which features panels of landscapes and floral festoons. Now, there's a couple of reasons why it's a particular pleasure to give a talk on the subject for the Armagh Robinson Library. And one is the library's connection with Rokeby Park, the seat of Archbishop Richard Robinson's family in Yorkshire, rebuilt by his older brother Thomas. And I'd really like to have included a lot more about the print room, which survives in this house today. But frustratingly, it's actually the most elusive of all of the print rooms on which I'm working. I'm heading back there in a couple of weeks to try and get a little bit further with it. Part of the problem is that there's no surviving documentation for this print room at all. The accepted wisdom is that it was created by John Sorry Morritt, who bought the property from Thomas Robinson in 1769. But that raises a key mystery about the distinctive nature of the prints that make up the display. So as you'll probably have been noticing, the display is very much dominated by 17th century French material of a decidedly similar flavour to a considerable body of prints in the Armagh Robinson collection. Max Bryant noted in a talk for the library last year that the most repeated print in the collection is a view by Etienne Baudet after Nicolas Poussin, and there are 8 large landscapes by that printmaker after that artist pasted onto the walls at Rokeby. Dr. Bryant also commented on the substantial number of prints at the library by the 17th century French printmaker Robert Nanteuil, and oval portrait prints by him and very similar work by his compatriots dominate the lower registers of the display. And again, in the same way as there are a number of prints of figures like Louis XIV and Cardinal Mazarin at the Armagh Robinson, so those figures feature heavily at Rokeby. So this is something I'm still trying to pin down, but it seems that these prints could well have all been part of Thomas Robinson's collection. So the bulk of the collection, of course, went to his younger brother, Richard, together with his books and papers, and formed the Armagh Robinson Library. But it seems that some of his prints could well have been sold to Morritt along with the house and other contents, and were then used in this print room. The other broader reason why it's a particular pleasure to be giving a talk about print rooms for this institution is because some of the earliest evidence for print rooms comes from Ireland, centred really on a network of families based around Dublin. So the first trace comes from that redoubtable lady of letters and arts, Mary Delaney. In the 1750s, Mary was married to her second husband, Patrick Delaney, and was settled at his small estate of Delville, just north of Dublin. She enjoyed a close circle of friends amongst the local gentry and aristocracy, and she started to spread her wings in terms of her artistic work. So taking up oil painting, producing topographical drawings, that kind of thing. In late June 1750, we find Mary Delaney writing to her sister, telling her that she spent a rainy day at nearby Lucan House, helping her friends and neighbours, the Vases, to make frames for prints. And then within the year, she was creating her own print room at Delville, as evidenced by this important thank you note written to her brother. I have received the 6 dozen borders all safely, and return you, my dear brother, many thanks for them. They are for framing prints. I think them much prettier than any other sort of frame for that purpose, and where I have not pictures, I must have prints. Otherwise, I think prints best in books. The manner of doing them is to have straining frames made as much larger than your print as will allow of the border, the straining frame covered with coarse cloth, the print pasted on it, and then the borders, leaving ½ an inch or rather less of margin around the print. Mr. Vasey has a room filled with prints made up in that way, and they look very well. Now this letter tells us all sorts of interesting things. It tells us how Mary Delaney set about making her print room. So in this case, she pasted the prints onto coarse cloth or hessian before they went up. And this was a common way of going about it, although many surviving print rooms do have prints more simply pasted directly to the walls. It also shows her buying borders by the dozen, and this was typical. So quite often it would cost you 1 shilling to buy 12 strips of border, and you'd then use strips to join them together to create frames to go around your prints. Effectively, as Mrs. Delaney notes, turning the prints from something you might keep stored in a portfolio to paper equivalents of framed paintings that you could paste onto the walls. The work that Mrs. Delaney and the Vases undertook in creating their print rooms was often painstaking, involving very fine equipment. And just to give you a sense of the kinds of tools used, I'm showing you here on the left a lovely little series of steel scissors included at the back of an album containing cut paperworks at the Victoria and Albert Museum that would be used for paper cutting and also be the kinds of things used to create print rooms. And then on the right, this is a wonderful silk needlework pocketbook, which Queen Charlotte gave Mary Delaney much later. And it retains these little tools, which, like the scissors, would be used for things like needlework, but would also be used for cut paperwork and for things like making print rooms. The vogue for print rooms really got going in this area of Ireland around Dublin in the 1750s, before it spread further through Britain in the following decades through networks of families, friends and neighbours. And those schemes by the Vases at Lucan House and Mary Delaney at Delville were notably early examples. Lady Clanbrassil made a print closet at her house in the area in the following decade, in the 1760s. And around the same time, Lady Louisa Connolly created one of the finest surviving print rooms nearby at Castletown. Now, Lady Louise Lennox married Thomas Connolly in 1758 and took up residence at his estate in County Kildare. And her voluminous correspondence shows that she was very creative, drawing, painting, embroidering, using flower stamps to decorate paper, all sorts of things. And she really threw herself into making all manner of improvements to the house and gardens at Castletown over several decades. And this process was very much one of creating a lighter, more decorative and more intimate effect in the house. So sash windows with slimmer bars were installed, and doorways were lowered. She oversaw a number of decorative schemes, including the staircase hall adorned with elaborate plasterwork by the Lanfranchini brothers, the long gallery later covered with delicate painting by Charles Reuben Riley in the fashionable antique style. And she also was responsible for this print room created in the anteroom to a bedchamber on the ground floor. And I think you can see on this slide the synergies between these decorative schemes in various media, so in plaster and in paint and in print. So in all of these schemes, you've got these references to the antique, the encircling of images with tendrils that crawl across the wall, use of the arabesque, very distinctive motifs like the swag and drop. And the vogue for the print room was very much part of broader stylistic trends in houses in the period. Louisa's sister, Lady Sarah Bunbury, helped considerably in creating the print room at Castletown. So Louisa wrote to thank her for some prints she'd sent in 1762, for example, but bemoaned, "I have not had time to do my print room yet." And then one issue which seems to have preoccupied such creators of print rooms was getting larger prints to offset more readily available smaller images. So in 1766, we find Louisa writing to Sarah to ask, "Any time that you chance to go into a print shop, I should be obliged to you if you would buy me 5 or 6 large prints. There are some of Teniers engraved by Labat, which I am told are larger than the common size. If you meet with any, pray send me a few." And there's also evidence of Louisa purchasing a considerable number of prints herself, both directly from print sellers and also by subscription. So in 1769, her finished print room was admired by Lady Shelburne as on the palest paper I ever saw and the prettiest of its kind. The room today retains its impressive display of more than 100 prints pasted onto cream painted wallpaper, cut variously into rectangles, octagons, ovals, circles, and given convex tops. The impressions are bordered with elaborate frames, illusionistically suspended from hanging devices like bows and interspersed with swags and trophies. And the cutting work in this scheme is meticulous. You'll be able to see from this that the range of images on which Louisa drew was quite broad. So there are prints here after Greuze, Teniers, Claude and Zoffany, for example. And many were predominantly the result of what would have been available on the market at the time and would create a good effect in a room like this. But some do seem to have been very particularly chosen. So over the fireplace in prime position, for example, we've got an impression of Edward Fisher's celebrated mezzotint after Joshua Reynolds's portrait of the actor David Garrick. Now, this was a must-have print at the time, and especially for a fan of Garrick like Louisa Connolly. So a few years later, for example, she wrote to tell her sister Sarah that she had seen Garrick play Lothario in Nicholas Rowe's Fair Penitent. And even though he, quote, had a wretched cold and seemed out of spirits, she thought he still did it better than anybody else could do. It was charming and I was exceedingly diverted. So she put his print up at Castletown, and you can see here that it's framed with a border made by the printmaker and print seller Vivares, which was actually published in the same year as Fisher's print. And then occupying the central position on the south wall, we've got another Fisher mezzotint after a Reynolds portrait, and this time of Louisa's beloved sister Sarah, framed with yet another elaborate border, with a lot of the internal elements meticulously cut out so that the paint of the wall shows through. And Louisa's account book records her payment of £1, 1s for Lady Sarah Bunbury's print in December 1766. Now, the print room at Castletown fits a general sense of the print room tradition in such literature as there currently is on the subject, that this was typical work for the amateur lady, a way to develop and use appropriate genteel accomplishments, a means of whiling away leisure hours, often in company. And the print room at the Vine in Hampshire also fits this bill, created by Caroline Wiggett, her aunt and her brothers around 1817. But here, Caroline and her siblings didn't go through the lengthy process of acquiring prints that Louisa had undertaken at Castletown. Instead, they had a lot of prints already at the Vine, mostly acquired by a previous owner, John Shute, in the mid-18th century. Unfortunately, Caroline's print room was in a state of such disrepair by the time the National Trust took on the property that they had to replace a number of the prints. But comparison with old photographs shows that more of the original material has survived than was originally thought, and notably this section of the west wall, which is largely original. And you can see here in the centre, you've got a print after Annibale Carracci's celebrated Madonna del Silenzio, which had been acquired for the Royal Collection in 1766 and was engraved a couple of years later by Francesco Bartolozzi. And then at the top, all four of the plates from William Hogarth's 4 Times a Day series. Caroline described the process of creating this print room around 50 years later in her memoirs, in which she recalls the experience of being adopted, aged 3, by William and Elizabeth Shute of the Vine. Childless, they turned to William's cousin, the Reverend James Wiggett, who had been left a widower with 7 children. Caroline was deemed, she says, the most eligible to be taken from the nest, and her account in her memoirs of being, as she calls it, transplanted into another soil is really bitter. Her memories of being finally allowed to meet up with her siblings, able to be, I quote, with those who really belong to me, were vivid, and she clearly treasured those occasions when her brothers came to stay with her at the Vine. The print room was created on one such occasion when her siblings had come to visit while she was getting over a bout of measles. The room at that time was a parlour, and Caroline recalls it being so much warmer than many of the other rooms in a decidedly chilly and damp house. And she clearly enjoyed sitting there with her aunt and her brothers, engaged in their project to decorate the walls. But one of Caroline's brothers, William, later unexpectedly inherited the estate. And as a result, in his own memoirs, he looked back on the creation of the print room rather more ruefully, writing, "Some of the engravings are too valuable for such a situation." However, whilst the print room at the Vine was clearly a homemade family project, many had such displays created for them by professionals. So not only did print sellers and printmakers like Sayer and Vivares both tap and feed into the vogue for these spaces in their marketing of reproductive prints and production of decorative items to frame and enhance them, but also some of those engaged in the furnishing and decorating industries offered their services for cutting and pasting that material. So, for example, when Sir Edward Knatchbull's new house of Mersham le Hatch designed by Robert Adam, was completed in the 1760s, he called in Thomas Chippendale's firm, then at the height of its fame and popularity, for the business of furnishing and decorating. In 1767 and 1768, Knatchbull bought large quantities of furniture from Chippendale. He contracted the company to put up wallpaper, and he also got the firm to create a print dressing room. So Chippendale charged a grand total of £14 and 10 shillings for cutting out the prints, borders and ornaments and hanging them in the room complete. The prints themselves were clearly provided by Knatchbull or perhaps another party, but you can see in this excerpt from the bill that Chippendale also charged for providing the paper borders, corners, festoons, masks and so on. So clearly by the 1760s, the print room was a fashionable product that you could seek to acquire somewhat off the peg. Another print room that was constructed professionally was that done for Sir Thomas Rumbold at Woodhall Park in the 1780s. This was created as a billiard room, originally with top lighting, but the skylight was later filled in when another story was put over the top of the room to create extra bedrooms. The print room at Woodhall was not only not done by Rumbold himself, a considerable amount of work on it actually happened whilst he was out of the country, working as governor of Madras for the East India Company. So Rumbold had commissioned the architect Thomas Leverton to design him a new house for his recently acquired estate in 1777. And then he had left for India the following year, leaving the project in the hands of his attorneys. He wasn't to return for 3 years, during which time those attorneys made necessary payments, and they even approved some changes in Thomas Leverton's designs. And those attorneys actually paid for subscriptions to 2 major publishing projects with a view to the prints from those series being used in the print room. And it was during this period, while Rumbold was away in India, that the creator of the print room must have been working on the display. And then when complete, he presented Rumbold with 4 elevation drawings and an accompanying catalogue identifying all the prints in the new room, proudly signing and dating his work. You can see it here over the fireplace, designed and finished by R. Parker, 1782. And unfortunately, despite far too much looking, the identity of R. Parker remains a mystery. Whittle Park is a particularly spectacular example of the print room tradition. It's got a larger number of reproductive prints than almost any other survival, as well as a lot of additional decorative material. And it's also very impressive as meticulously conserved by Alison McDermott and her team in the 1990s. But it's also a remarkable case because of those 4 drawings in the accompanying catalogue, which provide much more information about the scheme than is normally available. The catalogue is at first glance remarkably cryptic, so you open it hoping for a neat list of artists and engravers and titles, and instead you find a mishmash of seemingly random entries of differing lengths in different languages. However, it quickly turns out that these catalogue entries consist quite simply of whatever text was cut away from each of the prints when they were pasted onto the walls. So letterpress on prints is, of course, various. So the entries in the catalogue sometimes give you the name of the engraver and artist, if that was the text under the image. It sometimes gives the title of the print, if that was what was immediately below. But you might have a catalogue entry that's a dedication to a patron, or the name of the owner of the original painting, or inscribed verses. Whatever was under the image went into the catalogue. And you get a really vivid sense of the cataloguer sitting with the letterpress, transcribing it. And I think this print room has a striking immediacy as a result. Now, there are a couple of aspects of the Woodhall Park print room that I'd like to talk about briefly, because I think it highlights some of the key characteristics of these spaces more broadly. Now, one of those characteristics is the notable use of series of prints, which is very common in print rooms. So series of prints, say as catalogue flags, were widely available at the time. They saved publishers time and effort in the selling process, and they served as attractive commodities, whether sold ready to be bound as books, with the possibility of framed display, or expressly for print rooms. A series of prints in a print room could help to create symmetry and structure, and would generally give you a number of thematically united prints of the same dimensions. And a good example is use of the series of prints from Piranesi's Vedute di Roma, as used in the room at Woodhall. So there are 21 of these Piranesi prints in the room in total. And you can see from the arrangement of these ones pasted up on the east wall how they've been used symmetrically and also with an attention to matching, and particularly in these paired portrait format images of Trajan's column and the column of Marcus Aurelius in the centre. Use of such series also creates strands of coherence in the imagery, encouraging you to trace sets running through the display. Now, Piranesi's Vedute were immensely popular, of course, across Europe, purchased eagerly by grand tourists, very much framing general perceptions of antique and modern Rome with these images, which are very much characterised by their dramatic perspective and their striking lighting effects. And you find Piranesi's Vedute with striking regularity in print rooms. So they also feature in the print room at Blickling in Norfolk. There used to be a print room at Bretton Park in Yorkshire, which was entirely made out of Piranesi prints. And an account of a lost print room at Beaufort in Northumberland describes a drawing room 40 feet long, fitted up with prints, chiefly Piranesi's, on a buff colour paper. And I think there's a number of reasons for the popularity of Piranesi's in these schemes. The striking visual qualities of these prints and their fame and popularity are definitely key, but there's also the matter of their size. So generally around 40 centimetres high by 55 centimetres wide, they could fulfil that desire for prints larger than the common size expressed by Lady Louisa Connolly. Use of such series of prints also meant, on a pragmatic note, that you could get hold of a good number of images at one fell swoop, useful for creating a display which ran into several hundreds. I mentioned before that Rumbold's attorneys subscribed to a couple of publications with a view to their images being used in the print room. And these were two major multi-volume, heavily illustrated tomes produced in the 1780s. One about Naples and the surrounding area, and the other I'm featuring in this slide about Switzerland, its landscapes, people and history. And a substantial number of plates from both of these publications, so around 80 prints in each case, were used at Woodhall to create the bulk of the display. So essentially to fill up the walls and to offset the more important, expensive and famous prints like the Piranesi's. The second point I wanted to flag using Woodhall as my example is the amount of creativity you find at play in these print rooms. So this wasn't simply a case of trimming off the letterpress and then pasting paper frames around the edge. So for a start, you had a lot of choices when it came to applying the paper borders. By the time that R. Parker was working at Woodhall, the print trade was fully engaged in the vogue for print rooms. And print sellers like Vivaris were making available a wide array of borders and ornaments, but you could decide how to use them. So, for example, you could choose to cut out sections of the interior design to let the wall show through, as at Castletown. You could split borders with a number of bands, using them whole for larger prints or just segments for smaller prints. And you could use them in various orientations. So just to give you an example, this is a cable design used at Woodhall, and you can see how it's been applied with the cable running on the inside of the border for some prints, on the outside of the border for other prints, and then in some cases they've trimmed around the outside of the cable design to give an undulating edge. And then to add some more variety, sometimes this border has been quite simply mitered together at the corners, and then sometimes it's been used with these elaborate scroll corner pieces to create a more dramatic effect. But we also find collaging practices in print rooms, and this is most striking at Woodhall in a large print in the centre of the west wall between the windows. So this is the title page to a major publication of 1773, Gavin Hamilton's lavish set of 39 reproductive engravings after Italian old masters, executed by some of the finest engravers in Rome. Or at least it's the title page with a twist. So Hamilton's Schola was a very prestigious and very sought after series of prints, and every one of the 39 plates has been used at Woodhall. So these are reproductions of famed paintings by Raphael, Michelangelo, Titian, Correggio, and so on. And the shared origin of this rather disparate group of work is underscored by the pasting up of the frontispiece to the collection, which draws them together. But the frontispiece has been modified. So Parker, or someone working for him, has carefully cut around the figure of Moses in plate 16 of the Schola, after a figure by Parmigianino, and has pasted him at the top of the tablet over the original bust of Minerva. So these heavy foliate garlands become extensions of the drapery swathed across Moses' lap. Now, on the one hand, this is visually effective, so it makes the print a more substantial single element to sit in the centre of the west wall. But I think the collage title page also probably pays a rather clever homage to the Sistine Chapel, which is the source of the two ignudi either side of the tablet. So that added figure of Moses brandishing the tablets of law above his head echoes the figure in the same relative position in Michelangelo's scheme, God dividing light from darkness. There are numerous other examples of collage at Woodhall, but I just wanted to mention one more briefly, which is those tall pilasters which have been used to break up the larger expanses of walls. And these come from a series of prints here and here. These come from a series of prints illustrating Raphael's scheme in the second loggia at the Vatican. But in each case, prints of a pilaster from one bay in the loggia have been pasted on top of prints of a pilaster from another bay to double the height, which is why they've got this very tall, elongated, these tall, elongated proportions. And then finally, vases from another publication by Piranesi have been used to create elements to sit on the top of those pilasters. There's another example of this creativity at Queen Charlotte's Cottage at Kew, about which Kate Hurd has written a fascinating piece some years ago for the British Art Journal. So this little thatched building was constructed for Queen Charlotte in 1771 and was used for taking tea and viewing animals in the adjacent menagerie. A few years after the building was complete, the ground floor room was made into a print room using mostly prints by William Hogarth applied directly to the walls. However, it was then refashioned by Charlotte's daughter, Princess Elizabeth, in the early 19th century, and Elizabeth substantially altered and rearranged the display. She had the prints pasted onto canvas and mounted onto wooden stretchers, and she also introduced a selection of new prints from a dismantled scheme elsewhere in the royal residences, introducing French, Dutch, and Italian work. The prints had long been removed from the walls and placed in storage when a restoration project was undertaken by historic royal palaces and the royal collection, and they were then conserved and put back up in the cottage, although unfortunately there's no evidence of their original arrangement, so the current display is speculative. The most notable case of collaging here is the second plate from Hogarth's Analysis of Beauty, published in 1753, which shows a country dance. Now, unsurprisingly, the main image has been excised from the larger plate to remove all of those little diagrams from around the outside, which illustrate points in Hogarth's theoretical discussion in the analysis, and only really make sense considered in conjunction with the text. What's more surprising is that the central curved top has been echoed in a new section added to the bottom. And to avoid this being a blank space, a variety of fragments trimmed away from other Hogarth prints used in the room have been added to this new portion of the print. So the dancers appear to have discarded considerably more clothing than they have in the original. So a few hats, for example, have been taken from this plate of Hogarth's election entertainment. And then this portfolio you can see here has come from Hogarth's print after his self-portrait painting The Comic Muse. So this element here comes from this print here. Now, around the time that Princess Elizabeth was redoing her mother's room in the cottage at Kew, the print room was really reaching its final phase of popularity. It was also developing in new directions. And a number of these print rooms constructed in the first few decades of the 19th century were interestingly created by men, and they were focused on caricatures. So, for example, the 6th Duke of Devonshire created a now lost print room at Chatsworth in the 1830s using lithographs by Edmé Jean Pigalle. When the Duke came to write his guide to the house in 1845, he described this as a papered room in his new wing devoted to hospitality and entertainment, featuring all the amusing French prints and caricatures of the day. And a number of these Pigalle lithographs survive at the house, clearly showing damage from having been applied to and then removed from the wall. But the best surviving example of such a scheme, one of these early 19th century schemes of caricatures, is that at Cork Abbey, which seems to have been created by a father and son in the early 19th century. So probably begun by Sir Henry Harper Crewe and then continued by his son George. Caricatures by the likes of Thomas Rowlandson, James Gilray, George Cruikshank were cut out and framed with borders, but quite crudely. And they were then fairly roughly stuck to the walls, often one on top of the other, and indeed up to 3 deep in places. When the National Trust took on this property, they removed some of the concealed prints, but they did leave the layering where it was visible, and you can see that, for example, here over the fireplace. Tucked away on the ground floor of the house, near a billiard room and near Sir Henry's study, next to the service quarters, this was clearly another informal male space like the one at Chatsworth. One record in the Cork Abbey accounts shows that George Harper Crewe bought 7 caricatures from Rudolf Ackermann in 1835, presumably to add to this cumulative display. Ackerman was prominent in the next generation of print sellers to Vivaris and clearly interested in catering to this new transition of print rooms into the realm of whimsy. In 1800, he published grotesque borders for screens, billiard rooms, dressing rooms, etc., with etchings by Rowlandson after designs by George Woodward, and there's plenty of material at Cork from this publication. The shift here away from the elegant, fashionable print room of only a few decades previously is notable, and I think it's well underscored by Rowlandson's take on the tradition of the trophy. Now, trophies are artistically arranged ensembles of thematically related objects, and printed versions were very popular in print rooms. So on the left, this elegant trophy of musical instruments and sheet music was published by Vivaris in 1769, and I'm showing it here as it was used at Woodhall. But in the hands of Woodward and Rowlandson, a new vision of the trophy was conceived for this new spin on the print room. So they created these extraordinary, grotesque, grimacing heads with all manner of motley objects suspended beneath, and you can see here how they've been used at Cork. But there's one final late example I'll just talk about briefly before I close, which is a still more surprising one, which is the case of the print rooms at Stratfield Say. Now, after the triumphs of the first Duke of Wellington in the Peninsular and Napoleonic Wars, culminating in the Battle of Waterloo, there was considerable discussion about how best to honour the great hero. As well as numerous projects for monuments, bombastic plans for a Waterloo Palace were drawn up, a great country seat that would essentially give the Duke what Blenheim had given the first Duke of Marlborough 100 years earlier. Eventually, they settled on the site of Stratfield Say in Hampshire with a view to knocking down the largely 17th century, decidedly modest house on the estate, purchased from Lord Rivers, to make way for a new grand mansion designed by Benjamin Wyatt. But Waterloo Palace was never to be, and the Duke ended up settling into Lord Rivers's low-ceilinged house with its small rooms quite happily, making only a few modest alterations over the following years. He seems to have liked the house as it was, retaining a lot of the older features, and those included 3 print rooms. The most notable of Lord Rivers's print rooms was the gallery, which takes up 7 bays of the house facing the park. In the 1790s, Lord Rivers had decorated this with more than 300 prints, heavily featuring images from Boydell's Shakespeare Gallery. This is another extraordinary use of a series of prints, in this case a mammoth publishing project based on commissioned paintings of Shakespeare's plays by the most important artists of the day. But not only did the Duke of Wellington not dismantle Lord Rivers's print rooms when he moved into Stratfield Say, he went on to create more print rooms. The number is something of a movable feast, but it appears to have been as many as 9. Wellington began his print rooms project in the 1830s, significantly after his wife Kitty, from whom he was estranged and who'd been largely based at Stratfield Say, had died, and during a period in which he was in opposition. In April 1833, he wrote to his close friend Mrs. Arbuthnot, "I am proceeding with sticking up my prints and drawings. Your room will be beautiful. The room under it will be all Russian, others all Portuguese and military. You can have no idea of the number of prints that I have got. I shall have every bedroom in the house full of them." These displays were notably of personal interest and significance for the Duke. So there were scenes of the key battles and most famous episodes of the Peninsular and Napoleonic Wars. There were images of the peoples, landscapes and histories of nations like Portugal and Russia, which particularly concerned him. And then prints after Wellington's various portraits by artists such as Domenico Pellegrini and Thomas Lawrence were centrally positioned in each of the rooms, typically placed above the doorways. And the effect of surviving fabric at Stratfield Say is very different to that of the fashionable print room of the Woodhall Park era. So you can see here the prints are closely arranged, they're coloured, they retain their texts, and there are none of those ornamental flourishes in which Vivaris had specialised. The prints have been given borders, but only a couple of designs have been used, fairly muted affairs, and the cutting is fairly rough. A space like the current Duchess's study, a bedroom in Wellington's time, which leads directly off Lord Rivers's gallery, feels very much like a scrapbook. With a few exceptions, the prints in this room are united by the military theme, and they depict various personnel from the wars, primarily Wellington himself. There are commemorative images such as this large composite print of the Wellington shield. There are prints of military exercises, and there are lots of scenes from the most significant battles. So this room isn't about the kind of pattern making and decoration seen at Woodhall Park. This is really about reportage, a cataloguing of the triumphs of the Duke, his allies and his men during the wars. And the retained texts on the walls here emphasise the need to read the prints, pinning down the represented moments in the images above. So I'll wrap up the story of the print room after this point is a fairly sad one. So from its heyday as a fashion much in use in the second half of the 18th century, the coherence of the tradition dispersed. Many print rooms were dismantled in the 19th century, and those that survived often did so thanks to benign neglect, typically the result of a lack of decoration during a period when a family wasn't perhaps much resident at a property or were lacking in finances. But there was some resurgence in the mid to later 20th century, not least thanks to the sterling work done by Desmond Guinness, responsible for saving Castletown. Desmond Guinness not only published a number of articles about the print room tradition, he also reinvigorated the trend, getting Nicola Wingate Saul to work on a print room for him at Leixlip. His daughter Marina subsequently set up an interior design business with a partner, and together they made a number of new print rooms for a range of clients. And then at about the same time, the National Trust's work on the print rooms at their properties also contributed to a resurgence of the fashion. And John Sutcliffe created a series of replacement borders for the room at Blickling, and subsequently made them available to the public to buy. And in fact, he still has a stash if anybody is interested. Or the vogue for print room wallpaper has also had a resurgence, and a number of wallpaper manufacturers like Lewis and Wood offer modern equivalents. So the legacy does still live on. Thank you.